Hi everybody. Well, we're already on week 3. Kind of hard to believe, but here we are. So let's get going with this week's activities. So this week, what we're going to be doing on the discussion board is we're going to be conducting what I call a virtual brainstorming exercise. It's a virtual group exercise with 2 groups. And on the discussion board, and also on the document called the Week 3 Plan of Action, which is under the Week 3 Task and Resources, I notify each of you as to which group you're in. So I split you into Group 1 and Group 2. And Group 1 is going to be constructing the initial posts, not as a group, but as individuals. You're going to be constructing initial posts. And then everyone in Group 2 is going to be responding to the posts that were put up by the people in Group 1. And I'll get into a little more detail in a second here. But in addition to that, as you know from the syllabus and from the Blackboard site, that your first written assignment, which is your term project proposal, is due on September 12th. And please do refer to the assignments tab. And please let me know as soon as possible if you don't understand what I'm getting at with this assignment. This is a fairly straightforward assignment. I don't think it needs a lot more elaboration than what I've given you on the assignments tab, but I may not be clear, so please do tell me if you don't understand what it is you're required to do. Well, here's where we're at. As you recall, last week we talked about this issue of mandates, what it is an organization is required to do, either formally or informally, and you looked at the organization One World Community Health Center to try to tease out some of their mandates, whether those mandates are formal or informal. And we also talked about, from Bryson, this problem of people in organizations not even understanding what those mandates or those must-dos are within an organization. And this is a quote from a former student when I taught this course about a year ago. And this student said she worked in the development department at an organization, the development department being fundraising, and it wasn't uncommon for part-time staff at the branches and the home office to understand what the organizational structure or mission was. That, you know, she had overheard someone in her main office talking about how someone didn't realize what the association actually did, who it oversaw. So it's really actually pretty common in organizations to not have, you know, what some people might call the big picture. And that's a problem with a nonprofit, or it's a problem with any organization really, when people in the organization have limited or no understanding of what the mandates are in the organization. So that's something to think about, even in your own workplaces or in organizations you're part of. Do the people really understand what it is you have to do? Do they really understand the mandates? Now, this is from your text. This is figure 2. It's remember, I've shown you other diagrams from page 10 and page 16 with the Bryson models. This is yet another way of depicting the strategic planning process. And this one is called the building block approach. Note it's shaped like this pyramid, kind of in a hierarchical way of pursuing strategic planning. But you see that on the left-hand side, it's broken into phases. So just to kind of let you know where we're at and why we're approaching the class the way we are, look at that bottom row of the pyramid. Last week we looked at mandates. You see that's over on the 4th from the left. And this week, right in the middle there, we're talking about stakeholders. So those things down at that bottom row can be thought of as foundational elements of your strategic plan. We are going to look over at the far right where it says SWOT/T, analysis and environmental. That stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or challenges, and some people call challenges threats. We're gonna take a look at that too later on. So before you start a strategic plan in your organization, doing some of these foundational things are very important. So that's why we talked about mandates last week. That's why we're talking about stakeholders this week. And later on, we're going to talk about doing a SWOT analysis. And so just one more slide to talk about mandates, because it is important to understand mandates. If you're in an organization, do you understand what it is your organization does? You know, mandates provide the social justification and the legitimacy on which the organization depends. And because public and nonprofit organizations are externally justified, that means that legitimacy is a very important thing. You know, public and nonprofit organizations do not exist just because someone in the organization wants them to exist. And, you know, there are, if you listen to the political discourse, a lot of people will tell you, well, you know, let's say things like the public bureaucracy is not doing its job, or just a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington decided to do this. Well, in fact, those bureaucracies were set up by Congress at the national level, or at the state level by the state legislature, or at the city level by the city council. So in every level of government, these things we call bureaucracies have originally been set up by some legitimate elected body. And it is probably true that a lot of these organizations do seemingly get out of control. But in our form of government, then that becomes the job of the legislature, of the legislative body, to bring them back into the kind of control that they desire. So public and nonprofit organizations, all to say that is, they're externally justified, and they have to maintain that legitimacy. So they do have to understand what it is they're required to do. Now, as I said, this week we're on to stakeholders. And so I gave you some readings to do this week. If you look in the week 3 tasks and resources, you see that I'm having you read in your text from pages 89 to 107. And you're going to want to pay special attention to pages 102 to 103. And those are the pages that where we talk about this thing called the power interest grid. And then I also assigned you another reading from Bryson. This is an article from 2004, where this article talks more about this idea of stakeholders and the power interest grid, which is the exercise we're going to be working on. And then I gave you an excerpt from Bryson's larger book, published in 2011, pages 132 through 137, and that also talks about stakeholders. So armed with all those things, you should be able to address this issue of stakeholders fairly well. But what is a stakeholder? Well, a stakeholder is any person, organization, or group that can place a claim on the organization's attention, resources, or output, or is affected by that output. And Bryson, in his larger book, says, I usually argue that if an organization has time to do only one thing when it comes to strategic planning, that one thing ought to be a stakeholder analysis. So why would that be? Well, there's a link between mandates and stakeholders. Because to understand the mandates, the things you have to do, it's important to understand the stakeholders and what they demand. To create public value in an organization, we have to understand who the public is, and the public are stakeholders. To maintain legitimacy, we have to understand who it is that makes us legitimate. And again, as I droned on about in the last slide, organizations don't really exist for their own purposes. So who are the people, the stakeholders, that drive the demands on your organization? This is a real simple diagram. You'll see something like this. This isn't exactly what you'll see, but something like this on pages 94 and 95 of your text. And so we have this notional organization, and so this spoken hub diagram shows some of their stakeholders. So, you can look and see that it includes employees. Those are internal stakeholders. It might include government regulators. It might include vendors, people who are selling things to the organization. It might include the media. For example, the city council in a large city is constantly being given media requests. So is the media a stakeholder? It might include boards of directors. It might include people from the industry community or the business community. It does include people from the general public, including community organizations and volunteers. And it also includes people who are receiving services from that organization. So, for example, if you are an organization that is reaching out to the homeless, for example, you may be a stakeholder. At the same time, the people that use your services might be a stakeholder. So it's important to realize that the larger an organization has, the more stakeholders that it has, and these people are going to place demands on the organization. So this here is in your book on pages 102 to 103. This is called a power interest grid, and this gets at some of the particulars of stakeholders. Now notice this is a quadrant, and there's a title for each quadrant, and the quadrants are broken up by the degree of interest that a stakeholder has and the degree of power that a stakeholder has. So you'll notice in the article that I assigned you from Bryson, the 2004 article, they talk about this particular thing. For example, they say that a stakeholder with a high amount of power and a high amount of interest, and that would be in the upper right-hand corner, are what they call players. They say that a stakeholder with a high amount of interest but a very low amount of power, they call subjects. They say that a stakeholder with a high amount of power but a low interest are called context setters. And finally, they say that stakeholders with a low amount of power but also a low amount of interest are the crowd. Now, these names conjure up images in your mind, some of which you might not like. They just use these terms specifically to conjure up some of these images to get you to think about how organizations do think about stakeholders. And so when an organization approaches stakeholders, in my mind, it doesn't mean that if a particular stakeholder is in what they call the crowd, that they shouldn't pay attention to them. But the fact of the matter is, what they're saying is, lots of times the crowd isn't really going to express their stakeholder interest in the organization. So again, who are these people? It has to do with this equation between interest and power. There's an interest in what the organization does, and there's also power to change or not change what the organization does. And so in any kind of organization, we can imagine grouping stakeholders within these kinds of groups. So that brings us to this week's group exercise. And what we're going to do is, I call this a virtual brainstorm or a virtual brainstorming exercise. I think you've probably all been involved in brainstorming exercises where you throw up ideas on the whiteboard and then you come along later and you evaluate them. So this is virtual. It's got some limitations, but I think it'll work. If you're in one of two groups, if you're in group 1, you have a specific assignment. If you're in group 2, you have another assignment. And what we're going to be looking at is Omaha Metro, which is the bus company. And group 1, what your assignment is you're going to construct an initial power interest grid, and you're going to provide some justifications for your groupings. So look at the example on page 102 and 103 of your text. And also I've provided you a power interest grid on the discussion board to use as a template. And what I want you to do is I want you to, using the website for Omaha Metro, I want you to try to figure out who some of their stakeholders might be. So I want you to fill in portions of each of those quadrants. I want you to come up with stakeholders in each of those quadrants, and so that would be at least one per quadrant, but you can have more, several more. And then in your discussion paragraph, I want you to justify or explain why those particular stakeholders fit in the quadrants that they do. Then you'll submit that, and if you're in group 2, what you'll do is you'll look at all of those submissions from individuals in group 1, and each of you will assume that you're the group moderator, and your job is to come up with a final grid for the class, or for our group here. And so what I want you to do is I want you to look at everybody's different submissions, and then I want you to come up with what you would consider to be a final power interest stakeholders grid. And then I want you to talk about why you included the stakeholders that you did. And you might actually leave some out that other people included. But really what I want you to do is say, these are the stakeholders that I think apply, and here's why. And I discuss this a little more in the week 3 plan of action document under the resources tab. So that's it. That's your discussion assignment for this week. Please do get back with me if you have questions on the term project proposal, which is due in a week. And please have fun with this assignment. Thanks.